Welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk, insights, interviews, and practical tips on the teachings of the Buddha for people of all walks of life, attuning, exploring, integrating the teachings in everyday life. Simple Dhamma for daily life. I'm Asoko, hosting Dhamma Capsule for people like you. Hello, and welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk. This is episode number 2. Today I have the pleasure to meet with Ajahn Asoko. Good afternoon, Ajahn.
Good afternoon.
Very pleased to have you with us. Ajahn has about 20 years of practice, if not a bit more than that. And in terms of the school, we speak about Vasa, which means rains retreats, how many years of ordination. And Ajahn Asoko has about 19 Vasa.
That's correct.
So we currently are seated at Amaravati Buddhist Monastery in the UK. Ajahn, the idea I had to converse with you this afternoon is there is a tendency in the general public to sometimes narrow down Buddhism to just mindfulness, as well as considering the seated meditation practice as, I would say, the paramount posture. So I'd like you maybe to start by talking a bit about mindfulness. How does it fit in the Buddhist teachings? And then maybe elaborate a bit on the 4 postures of meditation, so as to clear the bush a bit on those 2 topics.
Well, these days mindfulness is all the rage. It's very popular. You can find a lot of teachings and courses. And it is a very good introduction to the Buddha's teachings. Mindfulness really as a word is kind of quite descriptive. It's about being fully here with the mind. And a lot of mindfulness is taught without necessarily being labeled as Buddhist, which is useful in the sense that it opens it up and makes it accessible to people who may be averse to the religious packaging. But in Buddhism, well, the Buddha teaches suffering and the end of suffering. And mindfulness is really about developing the ability to bring our attention to the present moment and learning to recognize what arises here and now in our experience, bodily and mentally.
So that would mean thoughts, emotions, feeling in the body.
Yes.
Impatience, things like that. That's what you mean?
Yeah, what the experience is of having a body, what it feels like, and what goes through the present moment in consciousness in terms of feelings, happiness, pain, in terms of memories, in terms of thoughts, emotions, moods, really everything, physical or mental. And by mental, I don't mean thinking. It's just more kind of anything that's not physical in terms of our experience.
So what does the practice mean? Recognizing in the present moment, I am experiencing feelings of anger or dissatisfaction. What do I do with them? What do we do with them?
Well, we're used to seeing things in terms of a self. What does it mean in terms of me? My body, my memories, my biography, my future and my dreams, my emotions, my views. And what the Buddha teaches us is all these things exist, but they're not personal. So he's encouraging us to look at the same experience, but from a different angle, where we're not looking at it in terms of self. It is what it is, but it's not personal. And that's a very different take on experience. And as we learn, if we trust the Buddha's teaching and we feel encouraged to have a look at things the way he encourages us to, we discover that inevitably when we take things personally, it leads to suffering. And when we learn to take things as they are, recognize them as phenomena that arise and cease according to nature, we're able to let things be and not create suffering on top of whatever the experience may be.
So that might be a bit tricky for the unacquainted. So can you give maybe of a personal experience or some example on simple example of how this can be practical novice, beginner's mind person out there waiting for the tube,
Well, waiting for the tube
or
is a
going
good
back
example.
home and being completely overwhelmed by the kind of day in corporate life, or simple examples like this? What would you suggest?
Well, the examples you give are good because they tend to bring us close to those emotions that we all feel, that we find life difficult sometimes, irritating, annoying. And so when we take annoyance personally, we get upset with what we're experiencing. The emotion itself is not a pleasant experience, but then we try to get rid of it. It's unpleasant. And so we either become annoyed and blame it on the outside world, or we can blame ourselves, or we try to get rid of it and repress the emotion. And neither of those two ways of functioning, of following it or repressing it, actually help. We're just creating more suffering and more karma around these issues. The way to experience this in a way that would not be personal, that allows us to let it go, is recognizing that the conditions are this way and it feels annoying. And to recognize that the feeling of annoyance arises in consciousness. We can be aware of it, we can feel it in our body, in our minds, in our hearts. And if we're just willing to let it be, allow ourselves to experience it and let it cease, then it does cease. And once it ceases, we haven't become involved with it. We've experienced it, let it come through consciousness and released it. And the experience of that cessation is what the Buddha is encouraging us to notice as peaceful.
So what about recurrent emotions that keep coming back? I'm talking about emotions because that emotion can be a very broad term that encapsulates a lot of things that can arise during the day, thoughts and feelings as well. Like anger can locate itself in the body. But it seems to me that you pointing out to where we can actually start practicing even when standing or laying down or being seated anytime. And that also that the Buddha seemed to not have given rules, but more like point, you're using this term quite frequently, to point at or to point to certain things rather than saying, doing it this way. You have to witness it by yourself. You have to observe it and investigate it by. These are terms that come back quite often. So would you elaborate a bit on this, please? Pointing at and not being get caught into this moment, but when we cannot go forward and we cannot go backwards, we need to start going inside. And then when we start going inside, we realize that there's a lot there. So what did the Buddha point at for that?
Well, he has talked about formal practice as much as mindfulness and daily activities. And when we talk about formal practice, we're talking about just taking some time aside from our usual activities and just connecting with the present moment. Now that, just as a general instruction, can be difficult to do. So there's a plethora of what we call meditation techniques, which are really tools, skillful tools. And what they're designed to do is to help us settle into the present moment as it is. And using the body is a very, very useful thing to do. It doesn't change as fast as thoughts or emotions, and yet we can relate to states of mind and emotions in the way the body feels. So it's very useful to come back to the body and just come back and check in with the body and ask ourselves, how does it feel right now? What posture is it in right now? And it's always a way of doing just anchoring ourselves here and now in the present moment, coming back to something that's neutral, from which we can start looking at what we have in terms of emotions, of moods, of states of mind. And as we use these various tools to just come back to the present, it allows sometimes, when we bring the attention to the body, it allows us to let go of whatever else attention is running after. It's a very good way of letting go of thinking, because as an instruction, let go of thinking is difficult to do. But if we bring the attention to something else, well, we need to let go of whatever it was chasing after in order to come back to. the body. So we use these 4 postures.
Yes.
So the Buddha talks about the 4 postures because basically we spend our whole lives in one of them, either of them, and we keep rotating between them. So it's
True.
walking, standing, sitting, and lying down.
Walking, standing, sitting, and lying down.
And walking, you can include running. It's that kind of movement. But basically, we're always going from one to the other. So it's a useful way to use our relationship to the body in such a way that we're using it to develop this ability to place our attention on something of our choosing. So if we give ourselves the instruction, I want to pay attention to what posture I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we get caught up in our activities, and then we can remember, oh, posture, what is it right now? It's sitting. And what does it feel like? And sometimes we have the time and the leisure to explore what sitting feels like. Other times we don't, because we're caught up in business that requires our attention. We can still check in with the body and never let the body too far out of our field of attention. A little bit like a mother who's raising a child who goes to the playground and starts conversing with another mother. She may have a conversation, but she'll never lose track of the little kid. And what is it safe? Is it okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, we check in with the body. And it's a way of just putting an anchor into the here and now in a way that we can go about our other activities, which tend to give rise to thoughts and emotions, bring up memories, be the conditions for states of minds.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get caught up in those. But if we use the body and keep coming back to the body and check in with the body, then we're giving ourselves a kind of a refuge that we can keep coming back to,
mm-hmm.
which gives us stability. So that stability is what is going to give us the possibility to notice what is unstable. The stillness allows us to notice movement. So we have to take that position of the stillness to notice movement. We have to come to a position of stability to notice instability. So the body is very useful in that way.
Right. So in that way, for instance, there are some people who find it quite constrictive and difficult to keep seated, and they force themselves in, for instance, which is honorable, to try to be having stillness and seated meditation, but they might feel that at some point it doesn't have to do with how many hours and how many minutes I've been doing, especially if I'm starting to feel pain and I feel like the body is getting very anxious to be constantly seated. I'm talking about seated meditation and seated, trying to calm the emotion, trying to observe the moment as it is and let things settle a bit. So what would be a good way to understand what kind of practice is suitable at what moment? Because the walking meditation is very different. If we are, from what I have heard, and you might have other example, is that if we have a person who tend to walk quite fast, the walking meditation would be advised to try to go at a bit slower pace, things like that. Would you have some examples? Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, the 4 postures are really a format of meditation to be explored by each individual. Some people sit down and find it very pleasant. Others sit down and feel restive and agitated and restless and they just want to get up. So we're not using the posture just for the sake of watching the body on its own. It's also going to reveal our relationship to what's happening in the mind. It comes as a package. So sometimes we may sit down and find it comfortable and enjoy it and watch the breath and feel peaceful. And other times we don't. We feel like we need to get up and move about and go and walk. So we can get up and go and walk, and we can go to the traditional format of walking meditation, which is on a path that's about 10 to 20 meters long, depending on the individual. And we walk back and forth, stopping at each end, pausing, turning around, walking again, and generally using that to just connect with, say, how the feet feel when they touch the ground at each step.
Good.
But then we can have periods when we feel overwhelmed by certain emotions, and walking back and forth on a meditation path feels constrictive. then we need to go and walk in the forest, up and down mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, the whole point of it is to learn to use the body and the awareness of the body, and then that gives us an anchor
Mm-hmm.
from which we can start noticing what's going on in the mind. Is the mind at peace, or is it agitated? Is it happy or suffering? Is it concentrated or scattered? And then we learn to adapt the position. We have to investigate and be playful and be creative, be curious. If I feel this way, how does walking work for me? How does sitting work for me? And learn. It's a discovery, a process of discovery. So there are a lot of instructions out there.
Mm-hmm.
None of those instructions apply for everybody the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd encourage people to find instructions and try them out and see how they work for them.
The best way it works for them.
And the measuring stick is it conducive to stilling of the mind? Is it conducive to awakening, to brightness in the mind? And is it conducive to understanding suffering and the end of suffering?
And the impermanence of conditioned phenomena. How is it in a very fast-paced way of life, for instance, the one we can have in London, and what would be a way for someone who says, okay, no, this is very, very fine, but I'm not really having necessarily the time to do that in that way. I'd like to have more ideas. What do I actually do when I'm standing in the tube and I'm getting very impatient? Somebody's like smelling very bad next to me, or have a very bad breath, or smelling alcohol, or things like that. I'm getting very disturbed. I'm noticing it. How can it possible to go beyond that just noticing? What happens beyond the noticing?
What happens beyond the noticing is the freedom from feeling constrained by our experience. The way the Buddha describes it is that our usual functioning is ignorant, and we are experiencing things that feel pleasant or unpleasant, or a lot of things just feel neutral,
Mm-hmm.
and our reactions come out of that. If it's pleasant, we want it. If it's unpleasant, we don't want it. So using these 4 postures, for example, standing in the tube and being confined in a tight space and cramped up close to people we don't want to be around,
Mm-hmm.
feels like this. And so noticing the difference between it feels like this and I want to get away from here, or it feels like this and I can open up to that and let it be and see how long that lasts, how much it disturbs me and how much space I can give it. So it is what it is, but it doesn't disturb me.
I think this is one of the most difficult aspects for the majority of people who are probably not necessarily acquainted to doing this kind of work with the mind and the body, and noticing the impermanence. I mean, this rising and ceasing. For those who are living by the Dhamma, it seems like something quite normal to think, or everything everything will come and rise and cease, and everything impermanence is all. It's a rule of nature. But for others, it's not necessarily. It's kind of tricky to notice that, including for their own mind. So I guess the important point would be noticing and learning to notice that these phenomena in the head could be depersonalized. It's not necessarily, it's about me, but it's not about me. It's something that happens at this very moment, and I can be, between brackets, at peace with it, move, and then notice that maybe tomorrow it will be a completely different. But that is one of the very main difficulty, I guess, for everyone. So this depersonalizing. Do you have any tips for that? It's a non-self.
It's a convention. The Buddha's teaching really is something to be explored.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha did not teach for the sake of people to take what he says as dogma, believe it, and put it up on an altar and worship it. He gave it to people as something to test out.
Right.
So investigating our experience and taking the Buddha's teachings just as a guidance of how to investigate, because otherwise we can really go out in any direction. The Buddha gives us some very specific pointers.
Mm-hmm.
So learning to take those and figure out a way of comparing what he's talking about with our own experience. We don't really need to learn that much. We only need a little bit, and if we do take that to heart and start investigating our own experience of life, asking ourselves, well, how do I see it? How do I feel about it? And how does the Buddha talk about it? And what's different? And his teaching is one that talks about suffering and what it is, and the end of suffering. How do I perceive suffering? How do I define suffering? And we very quickly realize there's quite a gap between my views and the way the Buddha talks about it. So it's interesting to explore that. One of my favorite quotes of the Buddha's is something we chant at funerals. And it is also something that puts the teaching in a nutshell, is that everything that is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. And in that cessation is peace. And it's very beautiful because we can be tempted to just take a teaching like impermanence and then just start slapping it onto everything as a label. But that's an intellectual exercise. It does not lead to wisdom. It's just basically dismissing everything as impermanent. When the Buddha points to the fact that in cessation there's peace, then that invites us to look at it and experience that peace. So we need to notice that things are impermanent, notice the cessation, and then taste the peace that is present once a disturbance has ceased.
It's a very important reminder that you just gave us there, that there could be a tendency to think that in the Buddha's teaching is all by, or the Buddhism in general is assimilated to nihilism, that there is nothing, everything disappears anyway, so we don't need to take care of it. No, indeed, it's rather the opposite. We take care of it, and then we notice that it's impermanent. That's where the gem to be, I would say, investigated and can start. That's where the practice starts. If I may say, there is a very nice statement, I would say, made by one of our teachers in this tradition. It's not just that it's like this, meaning taking the things as they are, but it's when starting this process of investigation, trying to start listening to the thoughts as though they were stories told by someone else, and then start noticing how there can be the silence in between two thoughts. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, it does come back to
the sound of silence.
There is peace, doesn't it? If we notice, we tend to function from an assumption there's always stuff happening.
Exactly.
And that's actually not the case, but we need to pay attention. We need someone to point out to us the fact that it's not constant. Suffering is not all the time. It arises and ceases. Thinking is not a permanent state of affair. Thoughts arise and cease. And to pay attention to those parts between thoughts, the silence between the thoughts, the space between the objects in the room, and what does it feel like when things cease before something else starts? We're so accustomed to things that we don't notice nothing, and yet nothing is also there, no thing. So to notice the absence of events. We usually keep busy, and then when busyness stops, we feel bored. That's what happens when the mind is just noticing things, activities. But if we stop and just watch at what boredom is, actually boredom is very peaceful.
Boredom is we don't call it boredom then.
Well, then we
call it, there's very little. So it reminds me of a say that goes, when we stop doing, we start being. And that's maybe where one of the starting point of, I would say, a mindful practice starts. How am I being? Noticing, investigating that, noticing, having patience as well, that things might not necessarily always turn out the way we wish them. So what would you say about thinking in terms of suffering? In people's minds, suffering tends to be more connected with very like either physical pain, like I've injured myself, or very big emotions such as grief, I've lost something, or my car got damaged, or anything. And well, suffering can also be very, very subtle, that we create that. On the thread of suffering and liberation from suffering, where are we going? What's the take there? There is no opposite to suffering, right? It's a thread, it's a path.
The opposite comes from thinking. Thinking is what differentiates and categorizes and separates. But in terms of Dhamma, just looking at when the Buddha talks about suffering, this Pali term dukkha, translated into English as suffering, it is a bit heavy.
It's
sometimes.
A bit narrow, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's really talking about the whole range of experiences that can go from a mild discontent and dissatisfaction to outright physical or mental suffering and some very intense experiences. It covers the whole range. So it's really about exploring. For a lot of people, it may be kind of defining it as discontent.
Not quite rightness.
Yeah. There are many ways to call it, but it's kind of looking at that aspect of experience, which is necessarily linked with desire, wanting it to be otherwise. We're not happy with the way it is. We'd like it to be otherwise.
We'd like to have it our way, at least not the way it is at the moment, but it is my way or another way, but not right there, not right now like this.
Right.
And so this points at, as well as in terms of to wrap it up a bit, our conversation. If the Buddha was on the street right now and I could ask him a question and say, what is this about? Say, what would he say?
Oh, I don't know what the Buddha would say.
But he left so many teachings. He left the Dhamma. So how we can start entering from the small door?
Well, not knowing is a good point to start from.
Not knowing what's happening.
Yeah, and if you don't know and you accept that that's your starting point, then you're open to look and learn. So what is happening, and then we're watching, and then we can learn.
Not knowing that we can control the reality, not owning everything. We're just passing by. Just passing by in this life.
I don't know.
Okay, Ajahn, I think this has been. Is there anything else you would like to share with us before we go?
Just encourage people to investigate, not to be afraid of experience, but just to investigate what's happening and be curious.
And investigate with
inwards.
Sometimes even that investigation can bring us to forgetting about being indulgent with ourselves, so not having too much.
Well, that's fine. And investigate indulgence.
Investigate
whatever is happening, to explore it rather than to get stuck with it.
Thank you, Ajahn.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon.